Okay guys, this is Mrs. Palmer. Welcome to my third video about how Lutheranism developed after Luther started his church and how it spread to other places and to other reformers who were living around Europe at the time. And so the first thing that I wanted to say is that because of the printing press and a number of other factors going on at the time, but primarily the printing press, his ideas spread very quickly, and they first started spreading throughout what we now call Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, in the 1520s, mainly in the cities, but they also began to spread to other places. Philip Melanchthon was a big supporter of Luther, and you can see his a portrait of him right here, and then the video version of him right here, the movie version, as they say, that of the film that we're watching right now. And Luther gained support not only of other very religious people who also wanted to see the church reformed, but also of people who wanted to follow him for secular reasons or because they would gain some kind of political or economic advantage. And he gained the support of some wealthy burghers, and that's burgher not spelled like a hamburger, but B-U-R-G-H-E-R-S, which is just a German word for town dweller, which is similar to the French word bourgeoisie. But there was some dissent within his own ranks, and so the splintering just began to go crazy with various people who liked some of Luther's ideas but really disagreed with some other ones and started to form their own kinds of reform movements. Another effect of Luther's movement was on society. There were social effects. In particular, the Peasants' War, which began in 1524 and ended in 1525, where peasants revolted against their lords. And at this time, Germany was still pretty feudalistic, so they thought that the ideas of Luther would also apply to their social situation, their economic situation, and they rebelled. And Luther, instead of supporting them, got extremely angry because Luther's view was that rulers are appointed by God and therefore they must be obeyed without question. And he believed that rulers are put there by God to maintain peace and order for the spread of the gospel, and that what the peasants were doing was not legitimate. It was nothing like what he was doing in standing up for what he believed to be justice and what was a desire, to purify the church. He thought that the peasants were twisting the gospel and trying to gain something economically from it. And so he got very angry, and he wrote a pamphlet called Against the Robbing and Murdering Hordes of Peasants, in which he is very, very harsh, and he calls upon the princes in the German lands to smite, slay, and stab the peasants, and to do whatever they had to do, including murder, to put down these revolts. And there is a scene in this movie that we're watching that is very interesting, and I'm not going to show the clip here in this, but it really does show sort of the heart-wrenching experience that was going on at the time and how there was just so much chaos. And in the movie, Luther looks very remorseful for having, been the cause of the slaughter of many of these peasants by their lords who revolted, who basically struck back. But I'm not sure how accurate that is historically. He may have felt a little badly, but I don't think he felt too badly, because he firmly believed that rebelling was against the laws of God and that we need to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, so to speak. The Protestant Reformation also had a significant impact on society. For one, it changed the role of women. For some historians, the interpretation is that it was actually a step backwards, because when the Catholic Church was dominant, women did not have to get married. If they didn't want to get married and have children, they could become nuns. So they had some other options that were acceptable. So the argument of these historians is that once Luther changed the role of women to being primarily wife and mother, then women had fewer options. And that, of course, is something that can be debated. But another impact is the increase in public education, because Lutheranism was founded on the idea that we call sola scriptura, that the Bible alone is our authority. And Luther, as we know from a previous lecture, translated the Bible and into a very readable German vernacular tongue, and he made it therefore accessible to a lot of people, a lot more people. And so because the Bible was now available and you could read it in your own language, that is, you didn't have to know Greek or Latin to read it, a lot more people wanted to read the Bible and to read other things that are out there. And so more people began to learn to read and write. So the argument is that public education became even more important with the Protestant Reformation, and literacy also began to rise. And actually, along with the idea that the role of women became somewhat more limited under Protestantism, the nuclear family became even more important than it had ever been before. So prior to that, family was really important, but you had multi-generational homes, right? So you had grandparents, parents, children, maybe even some great-grandparents if they lived that long, which was very unusual at the time. But you had cousins and other people in your family that were super important. Now your nuclear family, basically the parents and the children only, became ever more important and really the center of Protestant society. And then finally, one more thing that changed was popular culture. So in the Middle Ages, when the Catholic Church dominated Europe, there were lots of saints' days that were celebrated, feast days, and there were lots of ceremonies and public festivals that had to do with the various feast days of the Catholic Church. And now those things are kind of stripped away by the Protestants, and Protestants began also criticizing traditional entertainment and did not like the idea, for example, of like the Shakespearean type plays and things like that, because they thought they were too secular minded. So Protestants replaced some of these things with a different type of culture. And here's just an image of a 16th century classroom. It was kind of like the old one-room schoolhouse, if you ever watched Little House on the Prairie, where students of all ages would be sitting in a room at desks and doing work. And here are two portraits side by side of Martin Luther and the lady who would become his wife, Katharina von Bora, who had been a nun. Of course, as you know, Luther had been a monk, and they got married, and this really became an example for a new model of family life for Protestant ministers, because remember, Luther placed a lot of importance on ministers marrying. Here is just the movie version if you watched it with us in class. And here is just another woodcut that's kind of interesting of Luther versus the Pope. So meaning he's arguing against the Pope. There's a lot of symbolism in here as well. So here are just a few important dates. 1517 is one that you'll want to memorize, and that was when he posted the 95 Theses on the door of the University Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and then the Leipzig debate of 1519, the Diet, both the Diet, which is the court, and the Edict, which is the decree of Worms in 1521, where Luther was essentially declared an outlaw in his own country, in the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Peasants' War that lasted approximately between the years 1524 and 1525. There were also some important political effects. And I'm not going to get into these in great detail, but just know that the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, had a very vast empire and wanted to make sure that he was able to keep his power. He also wanted to preserve the power of the Roman Catholic Church. He was also a very devout Roman Catholic. But he had four main challenges. He had land disputes going on with the French. He had the problem of the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslim, wanting to push their way into Europe and conquer parts of Europe and probably ultimately conquer Europe as a whole. That was probably one of their main goals. He had some power issues going on with the papacy, with the Pope, and then there were some internal divisions in the Holy Roman Empire as well. For example, there were over 300 independent German states that all had, like I said, pretty much relative autonomy. And this was a big problem for trying to rule over such a vast territory without any real political unification. And then the Diet of Augsburg, another city in Germany, and Diet, again, just being like a court, was held in 1530, where Charles V essentially demanded that all Lutherans return to the Catholic Church. He gave them a deadline of April 15th, which also happens to be a very important deadline in America, if you are aware of it, and that is tax day, when everyone's got to have their taxes filed or there are penalties. In response, the Protestants formed something called the Schmalkaldic League, and there were a series of wars fought for a while between 1546 and 1555 throughout the Holy Roman Empire. And here's just a map of the Empire of Charles V. And as you can see here, he ruled over a fairly good amount of territory. And so he had a lot of problems trying to keep it all together. But he did fail in his main goal, to secure Europe for Catholicism. And so in 1555, he was essentially forced to recognize the equality of Lutheranism, and to allow each prince in his empire to choose whether they would be Lutheran or whether they would be Catholic. And this is the idea that we'll actually talk about in a minute, that whose realm, his religion. The idea that the prince chose whether to be Lutheran or Catholic, and everyone who lived in his jurisdiction had to be that religion or move, I suppose, so that they would not be able to practice their faith. So if you were Catholic living in an area where the prince was had chosen to follow Luther or to be Lutheran, you would not be able to attend Mass or receive communion or confession or any of the sacraments in that area. So what ended these Schmalkaldic wars? This truce between Charles V and the Protestants, that Lutheranism was now a legal religion in the Holy Roman Empire, something that Charles did not want to accept, but he ultimately had to. And it was the first step, and this is the significance. So if I'm going to ever ask you to memorize a date like 1555, I'm always going to only do that because I want you to understand the significance of that event. So it's not about memorizing the date 1555 and knowing that it was the Peace of Augsburg. It's understanding what the Peace of Augsburg was and why it was so important. And here's the big so what. Here's the big significance. It was the first step toward religious freedom in Europe. But it was only in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. It was nowhere else. So even though the Holy Roman Empire was a significant part of of the European continent. It was not all of it, but it is really important to understand that it was the first step towards some religious freedom. Now, this was not a personal choice. You couldn't choose whether you wanted to be Catholic or Lutheran, but your prince could choose. And so this Latin phrase, cuius regio eius religio, whose realm his religion, acknowledged that now, at the very least, which doesn't sound like a lot to us, but it was a big deal at the time, the prince would have some degree of religious freedom. And I guess if you were really unhappy with the choice of your prince, you could just move. But here is where the division of Christianity was officially acknowledged in the West. And then here are just some portraits of Charles V. I'm sorry, my dog is sneezing. Again, Corky sneezing. And so the spread of the Protestant Reformation just continued to sort of snowball. Lutheranism spread to Scandinavia, and the churches became state-run. And this is also a really important point to make here. We in America are very used to a total separation of church and state. But in Europe this time, there was no separation of church and state. So they were completely intertwined. So in those Scandinavian countries that had chosen Lutheranism, that was it. And you had to be Lutheran. There was another reformer that we'll talk about very soon named Ulrich Zwingli, and he was living in Switzerland, what we now call Switzerland, and so a lot of the church was pretty much state-run, Zwinglian churches, and then there was also Calvinist churches as well later. So you see Zwingli. Here's a little bit of some of the other reform movements. The Zwinglian Reformation, which just started a year after Luther's, the Anabaptists, the Reformation in England, and then John Calvin's Reformation as well. And we will talk about all those things in the next video. So thanks for listening.